The telegram arrived at the Kremlin on June 11, 1944, 5 days after Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. Joseph Stalin, 65 years old and in his fourth year of leading the Soviet Union through the most catastrophic war in human history, read the reports from France with an expression that gave nothing away. Around him, his inner circle waited. They had learned long ago that Stalin's face revealed only what Stalin wanted it to reveal. He dictated his response to Winston Churchill that same day. The words were carefully chosen, translated, transmitted through the diplomatic channels that connected Moscow to London. The summer offensive of the Soviet forces, Stalin wrote, organized in accordance with the agreement at the Tehran Conference, will begin towards the middle of June on one of the important sectors of the front. Then came the part that mattered, the acknowledgement the Western Allies had been waiting for. I congratulate you on the brilliant success of the Normandy operation. Brilliant success. 2 words in a telegram. Behind them lay 3 years of waiting, 3 years of dying, 3 years of suspicion so deep it had poisoned every interaction between the Soviet Union and its Western allies. Stalin's congratulations were genuine. They were also complicated in ways that no telegram could capture. To understand what Stalin said when he learned D-Day had succeeded, you have to understand what the previous 3 years had cost. On June 6, 1944, when American, British, and Canadian forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, the Soviet Union had been fighting Nazi Germany alone on the Eastern Front for nearly 3 full years. Not alone in the sense of having no allies. The Western powers had provided material aid through Lend-Lease, had fought in North Africa and Italy, had bombed German cities. But alone in the sense that mattered most to Stalin, alone in facing the bulk of the Wehrmacht's ground forces, alone in the grinding, endless land war that was consuming his country. The numbers tell part of the story, though numbers can never tell it fully. By June of 1944, the Soviet Union had suffered approximately 8 to 10 million military deaths. Civilian deaths were even higher. Estimates ranged from 15 to 20 million people by this point in the war, though the true number would not be known for years, if ever. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. The Germans had occupied Soviet territory containing 60 million people at the invasion's peak. They had implemented systematic starvation policies, murdered Jews by the millions, enslaved civilians for labor, destroyed collective farms and factories. The Eastern Front was not one front, but a line of battle stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Over 1,500 miles of combat zone where armies numbering in the millions collided in operations that dwarfed anything happening in the West. At Stalingrad alone, from August 1942 to February 1943, the Soviets had suffered over 1 million casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. At the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, Soviet casualties exceeded 300,000. These were not aberrations. They were the norm. And through it all, Stalin had been asking for one thing: a second front in Western Europe. Not aid, though aid was welcome. Not bombing campaigns, though those helped. A second front, an invasion of France that would force Germany to divide its armies, to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously, to pull divisions away from the east, where they were killing Soviet soldiers by the hundreds of thousands. The first request came almost immediately after Germany invaded on June 22, 1941. Stalin's foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, traveled to London in May of 1942 to press the case. Stalin wanted an invasion that year. Churchill explained why it was impossible: insufficient landing craft, inadequate air superiority, the risk of catastrophic failure. Stalin did not accept these explanations as valid. He saw them as excuses. In his mind, shaped by decades of paranoia and political calculation, there was another possibility: that the Western Allies were deliberately delaying, content to let the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany destroy each other. This suspicion was not entirely irrational. Churchill himself had said before the war that if Germany invaded the Soviet Union, he would support the Soviets, but his anti-communist credentials were well established. Some voices in Britain and America did argue for letting the two totalitarian powers bleed each other. Stalin knew this. He heard the whispers, read the intelligence reports, saw the delays mount. 1942 passed with no invasion of France. Instead, the Allies landed in North Africa in November, Operation Torch, opening a Mediterranean campaign. Stalin acknowledged this publicly as a helpful development. Privately, he saw it as a diversion, a way to fight Germany without bearing the main burden. The Germans still had over 200 divisions on the Eastern Front. They had fewer than 10 in North Africa. 1943 brought more delays. At the Casablanca Conference in January, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to invade Sicily, then Italy. Still no cross-channel invasion. Stalin was not invited to Casablanca. He learned of the decisions after they were made. The Sicily landings came in July, Italy in September. These were significant operations, but they were not what Stalin wanted. Italy was not France. The Mediterranean was not the Channel. The bulk of the Wehrmacht remained in the east. By the time of the Tehran Conference in late November 1943, Stalin's patience had worn to nothing. This was the first meeting of the Big Three: Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, together. Stalin came to Tehran with one primary objective: to pin down the Western Allies on a date for the invasion of France. Not vague promises, not conditional plans. A date. The discussions at Tehran were tense. Churchill still favored operations in the Mediterranean, potentially through the Balkans. Stalin saw this as another delaying tactic, another way to avoid the main event. Roosevelt sided with Stalin. The decision was made: Operation Overlord. The invasion of France would be launched in May of 1944. Stalin, in return, promised a major Soviet offensive timed to coincide with it, to prevent Germany from moving forces west. Even then, Stalin did not entirely believe it would happen. His suspicion ran too deep. Throughout the spring of 1944, as the Allies massed forces in Britain, Stalin watched for signs of betrayal. The nightmare scenario, from his perspective, was a separate peace: that Britain and America might negotiate with Germany, perhaps even after Hitler was removed, leaving the Soviet Union isolated. It was not an impossible scenario. There were elements in the West who would have preferred such an outcome. Stalin knew this. It shaped everything he did. So when the reports came through on June 6th that the invasion had begun, Stalin's first reaction was relief. Not joy, not yet. Relief. The Allies had actually done it. They had crossed the Channel. They were fighting in France. The initial reports were fragmentary. Airborne drops overnight, naval bombardment at dawn, landings on 5 beaches, casualties heavy, but the beachheads holding. Stalin followed the news throughout the day, receiving updates from Soviet intelligence, from official Allied communications, from monitoring of German radio traffic. By the evening of June 6th, it was clear the invasion had succeeded in its first objective. The Allies were ashore in France. Stalin's telegram to Churchill on June 11th was diplomatic, carefully worded, but the congratulations were sincere. He called the Normandy operation an unheard-of achievement in the history of warfare. He noted the scale, the crossing of the Channel, the massive landings, the successful establishment of beachheads. These were not empty compliments. Stalin understood military operations. He knew what the Allies had accomplished. But understanding Stalin's reaction requires looking beyond the official telegram. Vyacheslav Molotov, who served as Stalin's foreign minister throughout the war and knew him as well as anyone could claim to know Stalin, later recalled that Stalin was genuinely pleased by D-Day's success. The relief was real. 3 years of waiting, 3 years of bearing the overwhelming burden of the ground war, and finally the second front had opened. Yet the pleasure was mixed with other emotions. Vindication, for one. Stalin had been right to keep pressing, right to refuse to accept the delays as inevitable. If he had not pushed so hard at Tehran, would Overlord have happened in 1944 at all? Stalin believed his pressure had been essential. There was also a continued wariness. Stalin did not suddenly trust his Western allies because they had invaded France. Trust was not something Stalin extended easily, and the 3 years of delays had confirmed his worst instincts about Western intentions. D-Day was a positive development, certainly, but it did not erase the past. Stalin would continue to watch for signs of betrayal, continue to protect Soviet interests with the assumption that his allies were doing the same for theirs. And there was something else in Stalin's reaction, something harder to quantify, a grim satisfaction that the Western allies were finally going to learn what the Eastern Front had been like. The fighting in Normandy was brutal. The hedgerows of France, the German resistance, the casualties mounting in the fields and villages, all of this was new to the British and American forces, in a way it had not been new to the Soviets. The Red Army had been fighting this kind of war since 1941. Now the Western Allies would understand, in a direct and bloody way, what it meant to face the Wehrmacht on the ground. Stalin's telegram to Churchill mentioned the Soviet summer offensive, promised for mid-June. This was not a spontaneous offer made in response to D-Day. It had been planned for months, coordinated at Tehran, prepared throughout the spring. Operation Bagration, named after a Russian general who had fought Napoleon, was designed to be the largest Soviet offensive of the war. Its target was German Army Group Center in Belorussia, the bulge of German-occupied territory that still extended deep into Soviet lands. The timing was deliberate. By launching Bagration 2 weeks after D-Day, the Soviets would ensure that Germany could not shift forces from east to west. The Wehrmacht would be pinned, fighting desperately on 2 fronts simultaneously. This was what Stalin had wanted all along. Not just a second front, but a coordinated strategy that would crush Germany between 2 massive offensives. Operation Bagration began on June 23, 1944. The scale exceeded even D-Day. The Soviets committed over 2 million men, over 4,000 tanks, over 24,000 artillery pieces. They faced approximately 800,000 German troops of Army Group Center. The Soviet offensive was devastating. Within 2 weeks, Army Group Center was destroyed as an effective fighting force. The Germans suffered over 300,000 casualties, including 170,000 captured. The Soviets pushed westward, liberating Minsk on July 3rd, crossing into Poland by late July. In terms of military impact, Bagration was arguably more significant than D-Day. It destroyed an entire German army group, killed or captured more German soldiers, advanced further and faster. But history remembers D-Day more vividly, in part because it was the Western Allies' great triumph, and in part because the Eastern Front had become so vast, so bloody, that individual operations blurred together in a continuous catastrophe. Stalin understood the relative importance of the 2 operations. He also understood the political reality. D-Day would be remembered as the turning point by the Western Allies, regardless of what was happening in the East. This did not particularly bother him. Stalin was focused on results, not historical memory. What mattered was that Germany was now fighting the war he had wanted them to fight since 1941, a 2-front war they could not win. The opening of the second front changed the dynamics of the alliance in subtle ways. With both the Soviets and the Western Allies fighting major ground campaigns against Germany, there was less room for the suspicions that had plagued the relationship. Everyone was committed now. Everyone was bleeding. The arguments shifted from whether to invade France to how to coordinate the final defeat of Germany, how to divide the occupation, what would happen after the war. Stalin's public statements about D-Day and the Western Allies became more generous after June 6th. At a dinner with Averell Harriman, the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, Stalin made toasts to the success of the invasion, to the bravery of Allied soldiers, to the cooperation between the powers. These toasts were sincere in their way, but they were also diplomatic. Stalin was many things, but he was always calculating. The war was not over. The alliance was still necessary. There was no benefit in dwelling on past grievances when present cooperation was required. The Soviet press gave prominent coverage to D-Day. Pravda, the Communist Party newspaper, described it as the long-awaited opening of the Second Front in Europe. The coverage emphasized both the scale of the Allied achievement and the Soviet role in making it possible. By tying down the bulk of German forces in the East, the Red Army had created the conditions for D-Day's success. This narrative was not entirely wrong. The Eastern Front had indeed been the decisive theater for 3 years. But the framing also served Stalin's purposes, ensuring that Soviet citizens understood their sacrifices had been central to the war's outcome. For Stalin personally, D-Day represented a kind of closing of accounts. He had asked for a second front. He had been made to wait 3 years. He had suspected the worst of his allies, and in the end, they had delivered. Not when he wanted, not as soon as he believed possible, but they had delivered. The invasion had succeeded. The Wehrmacht was now fighting on 2 fronts. Germany's defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. Yet Stalin's reaction to D-Day cannot be separated from his broader worldview. He was not a man who forgot slights, who forgave delays, who trusted easily. The 3 years between 1941 and 1944 had confirmed his belief that nations acted in their own interests, that alliances were temporary arrangements of convenience, that power was the only reliable currency in international relations. D-Day did not change these beliefs. It simply meant that, for now, Soviet and Western interests aligned. In the months after June 6th, as Allied forces fought through France and Soviet forces pushed through Poland, Stalin began thinking more seriously about the post-war world. The shape of that world would be determined by military facts on the ground, who occupied what territory when the war ended. Stalin understood this better than most. He had learned the lesson in the Russian Civil War, in the purges, in the brutal calculus of Soviet politics. Power came from control, and control came from presence. The alliance that had made D-Day possible would not survive the war intact. Stalin knew this even as he congratulated Churchill on the brilliant success in Normandy. The contradictions were too deep between communist dictatorship and capitalist democracy, between Soviet territorial ambitions and Western principles of self-determination, between Stalin's paranoia and the West's eventual exhaustion with accommodating it. But that was a problem for later. In June of 1944, the problem was defeating Germany. D-Day had brought that goal significantly closer. Stalin's telegram to Churchill on June 11, 1944, contained fewer than 100 words. It congratulated the Allies on their success, mentioned the coming Soviet offensive, and maintained the diplomatic courtesy that characterized official communications between the powers. But behind those words lay 3 years of history, of waiting, of dying, of suspicion, of pressure, of relief. Behind them lay 8 to 10 million Soviet military dead, 15 to 20 million civilians killed, a country devastated from Leningrad to Stalingrad. Behind them lay Stalin's calculation that his allies had delayed as long as they dared, and his satisfaction that they had finally done what he had demanded. What Stalin said when he learned D-Day had succeeded was, officially, a message of congratulations. What he felt was more complex. Relief that it had actually happened. Vindication that his pressure had worked. Continued wariness about Western intentions. Grim satisfaction that his allies would now share more fully in the burden of ground combat, and cold-eyed recognition that the war was entering its final phase. The second front had opened. The Wehrmacht was caught between 2 massive armies. Germany's defeat was assured. Stalin was not a man given to emotional displays. He did not celebrate D-Day with champagne or public speeches. He received the news, sent his telegram, and turned his attention to Operation Bagration. There was still work to do. The Red Army was advancing, but Soviet territory remained occupied. Germany was beaten, but not yet defeated. The war would continue for another 11 months, through the winter, through the spring, until Soviet forces raised their flag over the Reichstag in Berlin in May of 1945. But on June 11, 1944, when Stalin dictated his message to Churchill, something had shifted. The Second Front was no longer a demand or a promise or a source of bitter dispute. It was a reality. Allied forces were fighting in France. The Soviet offensive would begin in 12 days. Germany was about to be crushed between two fronts, exactly as Stalin had wanted since June of 1941. The telegram congratulating Churchill on the brilliant success of the Normandy operation was, in its way, the most important thing Stalin said about D-Day. Not because it captured the full complexity of his reaction, no telegram could do that, but because it marked the moment when the alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western powers became finally what Stalin had always insisted it needed to be, a genuine two-front war against Nazi Germany. Everything else, the relief, the vindication, the continued suspicion, the cold calculation of post-war advantage, remained unspoken. Stalin had learned long ago that power came not from saying what you felt, but from controlling what others knew about what you felt. His telegram said what needed to be said. The rest he kept to himself. The war would end in Soviet victory, in Western victory, in the defeat of Nazi Germany and the liberation of Europe. But the cost of that victory for the Soviet Union had been paid largely in the 3 years before D-Day, in the years when Stalin waited for the Second Front to open, when Soviet soldiers died by the millions on the Eastern Front, when entire cities were destroyed and populations decimated. D-Day did not erase that cost. It simply meant that, for the final year of the war, the burden would be shared more equally. Stalin's congratulations to Churchill were genuine. They were also, in their way, an acknowledgement of accounts finally balanced. The Western Allies had done what Stalin demanded. Now the war could be finished. The telegram was brief because there was nothing more that needed to be said. The Second Front had opened. That was